Hi, welcome back to part two of Do You Own Your Stuff or Does Your Stuff Own You on the Silver Linings Transitions podcast. Big breath. Okay, so in the first part, we talked about a little bit about who Silver Linings Transitions is, who I am, and why we hold on to our stuff. So in the next part, we're going to start talking a little bit about what being disorganized, what chaos it creates in our lives. And so here we go. So this is an interesting statistic that over the course of our lifetime, we will spend 153 days searching for misplaced items. So, and the items that are typically often the most misplaced are phones, keys, glasses, and paperwork. And so a lot of us are disorganized. Sometimes it's not disorganized. It's just too much going on in our brains. There's a Saturday Night Live did an Alexa for seniors. And if you haven't seen it, I highly, highly recommend it. Just Google Saturday Night Live Alexa for seniors. And there's one scene where the person who has the Alexa, and I forgot I have one now. Does anybody else feel like they have to say please or thank you to their Alexa? But anyway, she says, because I think she calls her Amanda, "Where is my phone?" And Amanda says, "It is in your right hand," which is so funny because, sometimes you open the refrigerator and you don't see it. And that's sort of how it is with organizing, actually. It's that sometimes we look at something so many times that we just don't see it anymore. And it's a really good idea to have another person come in and help you with that. All right, so this is a big one that I hear. When I do the talk, a lot of people will say that they expect that their children will deal with it. And that is absolutely, absolutely not the solution. I want to tell you why. Again, I've been through the experience when my grandmother passed away. And I will tell you that my family fought over her belongings. And, it's funny because she had said that there was a favorite lamp, which I'm going to show you a picture of later in the talk. But I was a 4-year-old and she had bought the lamp. And I always, whenever I would visit my grandmother, I don't know when it started, but it was always like, okay, this is my lamp. This is my lamp. It is now on my nightstand. But it was not given to me when my grandmother passed away. My mom and uncle decided to give it to a favorite cousin who was more like a niece to my grandmother. And I felt like I didn't have a say. And I did, as I said, finally get the lamp. But I will tell you that I have other family where there's been a death and police have had to be called in. So that's one reason why you don't want that to be the answer. But the other reason is a lot of people will just call a charity to come in and take it all away. And there are some things in there that you probably don't want taken away. There may be some valuables that have been hidden. There may be, some important memorabilia or family history. So going through it on your own is a gift that you can give to your loved ones. And what often happens, and we're going to talk about it in Swedish Death Cleaning when I talk about that in this one of these other episodes, is that it's for people who have had adult parents who they've either moved into senior communities or moved into smaller homes and are dealing with all of this stuff, or their loved one passes and now they have all of this stuff and they have adult children and they think, I am not going to do this to my children. So going through it proactively is a gift that you can give to your loved ones. They don't need to deal with all your stuff. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have a game plan and you'll be ready to go. Okay, so this is actually taken at a client's home, and I think it's important to read, and that is, clutter is sneaky. It creeps up on us. It hijacks our home when we are distracted and can't defend ourselves, when we are paralyzed by grief after losing a loved one or incapacitated by illness. it weasels its way in when we are too busy to notice after a new baby arrived or a stressful new job started. And it can instantly swallow our house when we downsize, merge several households into one, or inherit a lost relative's possessions. But the main reason why we keep buying, collecting, and hoarding is low self-worth. I'm going to add to, it's not just low self-worth. I didn't write this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm seeing with the trend with the pandemic. And that is, I'm sure anyone who at least lives in the US knows that we had an issue with toilet paper. And I think what happens is, and I will tell you, I recognized myself as a food hoarder. I got really nervous that there wasn't going to be food, and I started stockpiling things. And I will say I've been pretty good about not shopping online too much, but I definitely know I have too much food. And so what happens when we are anxious is and I'm talking about people who have no mental illness at all, when we are in times of uncertainty or anxiety, we will buy things to ground us. And that is definitely what we saw with, the entire country going into stress mode. So you could probably look within yourself and see, where you did that. And I want to talk about some of the reasons that clutter is bad. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about hoarding because, as I said, I'm taking a talk that's normally, it can be anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour to 2 hours. And I want to be able to delve into more. So first of all, that clutter is anything. That was not placed in the right place. Clutter is anything that gets in the way of the life you want to be living. And I have found that the way that you live is truly a manifestation of what's going on in your life. One of my very best friends and I went walking today. It was interesting. And we were talking about her house and how organized it is. It's meticulous. And that is a manifestation of her desire to have everything seem and be perfect. I have ADHD and I've gotten much better about it, but a lot of times my brain is a little shuffled. And so I have a lot of stuff around me. And again, we're not going to quite go into hoarding, but there's a component there. And the other thing is, again, that physical clutter is a physical manifestation of what's happening in our lives. And there's some really, really important reasons to eliminate the clutter. One of the exercises, and I'm going to do this here, even though it's a little kind of funny, but I do it when I give the talk, is I want you to close your eyes and I want you to think about being in a room that is filled. And, take a look at this kitchen if you need something to give you an idea, but think about how you would feel in a room that was just filled, or picture yourself in this kitchen. How does this make you feel? And usually I will ask people if they have, my new favorite word is visceral reaction, but I get a tightening in my chest when I think of a space like that. I don't feel good. And now think about being in a space that's open and clear. And you feel lightness. I love, one of my favorite professional organizers is Peter Walsh. He used to be on, I think he had his own show even, but one of the stories that he tells that I really, really like is he says that 100% of the time, which means that he's never, ever had it not be the case. When they've done a child's room, when they've gone into a home and the child is, living in whatever they're living in, and they get into that child's room, he said the first thing that a child will do when they go into a space that's been cleared of clutter is dance. Because we just feel freer and lighter. And so that's a huge reason to address the clutter in your lives. But the other reason is that when we live in clutter, we don't feel as healthy. We already talked about that. We don't eat as healthy. If we don't have access to our kitchen counters and we can't access healthy food because it's buried in our refrigerator, that can play havoc. I've definitely seen that as seniors age, their eyesight isn't as good. They don't see labels. They're not eating as well. Poor mental health again. And again, it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it a manifestation of what's already going on? or is it contributing? And I would argue that it doesn't really matter. I think if you clear the clutter, you're going to be healthier mentally. It's harder to visually process. It's harder to think clearly. There's also a cost associated with disorganizing, and that's actually not just, this was an article that I took from, and that I want to talk about the cost, because one of the things that we do when we go into a senior's home, and we are helping them go from, usually a much bigger space into a smaller one, usually a 1 or a 2 bedroom into independent living when they're moving into senior communities. We also do downsizing when they're going to age in place but need to go to a smaller space. But we gather everything up. And what I notice is a lot of duplication, because I think what happens is that people don't remember where they put things. And so rather than going around and trying to find where it is, they just buy a new one, or they don't remember that they even had it. So that's another benefit to being organized. Okay, so we talked a little bit about why we hold on to stuff. Again, we talked about the memory, our memory of it, and also maybe that we want our loved ones to have memory of our belongings, or our memory of a loved one's belongings. We hold on to things because I might need it someday. We hold on to things aspirationally, which we'll talk about as we go on. We hold on to things because of the value. We paid a certain amount for it, and we don't want to get rid of it because we think it's throwing money away. And we also hold on to things because we want to give them to our loved ones. And then finally, because we just become overwhelmed. So by the end of this 4-part series, I know that you will feel less overwhelmed. The picture that I have in the slideshow, if you're listening to it in a podcast, is a curio cabinet, and it is filled to the brim with Hummels and plates. And you cannot even see the Hummels that are in there, but I know Hummels were quite expensive. I don't know the value of Hummels. It was never something that I ever bought. I know Yadros can be, a couple $100s. And what happened, especially with the greatest generation who were really impacted by the Depression, is they accumulated belongings thinking that those belongings would hold value for them, because there was no uncertainty when they grew up with such a scarcity mindset. But what I will also say is that there is no way this client is enjoying those Hummels. There are just too many of them. You can't even see what's there. But what would be a better way of decluttering, also making it easier to take care of it, but also appreciating her belongings, would be to select a few, maybe 4 or 5 that she absolutely loves, and showcasing those. And I promise you, she will, in fact, probably feel better appreciating the 5 that she took the time to select that are her favorites, rather than holding on to, there are probably a couple hundred in that picture. So that's why we hold on to stuff. Okay, this one, we were talking about the lamp, and one of the reasons that I mentioned that people hold on to belongings is that they want to give them to loved ones. And what I will argue is that or not argue, just kind of state a fact, that everybody wants to be remembered. We want to know that when we leave this earth, that we will be loved and remembered. And I don't think holding on to a belonging is going to make you, or having a loved one take the belonging, doesn't necessarily mean you won't be remembered. And I want to share a funny story. So I already told you about the lamp. So the picture that is on this presentation is me standing in my grandparents' condominium, definitely in the 80s, because I had just graduated from college. It was high school, 1988. And there's the lamp, and it's a tulip lamp with, it's like a ceramic, and it's pink tulips, and it's in a little white basket. And in my grandmother's home, it had a green lampshade. Now in my home, on my nightstand, I replaced the lamp shade. The green isn't that 90s green, or that late 80s green, hunter green. It's white, and I do love the lamp. And the picture next to the lamp was a picture of my grandparents. So as I mentioned, I loved my grandparents very much. Think of them often. But when my grandmother passed away, my mother wanted me to take my grandmother's china. And I said I wasn't even using my china. I wasn't going to take my grandmother's china. So I like to drive home the point that just because it isn't wanted doesn't mean you aren't loved. So we need to let go of the belief that our loved ones have to take something of ours for us to be loved or remembered. I definitely took things from my grandmother. I like to show, I'm doing this talk in my house is kind of fun. So this was something that, it's a little lucite woman. I didn't even know what it was growing up because we didn't light the Shabbat candles. But it's one of the things that I took from her house, and it's a woman lighting the Shabbat candles. And it's an etching. So, little things like that. But I loved my grandmother, didn't want her china. And it ended up, if it could be sold, I don't remember. That was a while. It was before I was in this business for sure. I'm taking a sip of water for those of you who are listening because my voice is starting to get hoarse. Okay, this is a really important point. Following after just because it isn't wanted doesn't mean you aren't loved. And the reason behind a lot of the idea is that we are generationally different. And as I talked about, the people who came from the greatest generation, the Depression era, they held on to their belongings. There was scarcity. They had to use something until it couldn't be used. And I love this story. It's such a great example. So the picture that I am showing in the top right corner is the community that they moved into, and you can probably see that there is a full kitchen in the back of the photo. So this was, I think it was a 1-bedroom. It had a living room, a little place to sit and eat, and then it had a kitchen and a bedroom. So when we were going through their home, this was actually a case. Typically, when we help a client move, we go through the sorting with them. But in this situation, they had an adult daughter. They were ready to make decisions, and they didn't feel like they needed us. A lot of times what happens when there are adult children involved is that there can become a little bit of a battle. And, you have an adult child that is trying to parent their parents, and that doesn't go well. So it's really important when going through this process, if you are bringing in a loved one, that you set the ground rules, and that is that the parent is the parent. And if you can't set that rule up and follow it, then that's a good idea to bring in a third party. And the other thing is that it can be an emotional time when adult children are moving parents into senior communities and giving up family homes. But anyway, back to the story. So in this situation, they were getting along really well. They were moving into a community that had 3 meals a day, and it was a couple. And she was done cooking. She's like, I've cooked for 60 plus years and I'm done cooking. So, they narrowed their kitchen down to 1 cabinet and 1 drawer. So when we got there to pack the home, there was maybe 2 boxes for the entire kitchen. Now, if you look at the picture, or if you're listening to the podcast, it's a pretty good sized kitchen. And what was interesting is the picture that I have on the left is actually an old ice cutter, like an ice tray. And it's stainless steel, and it's one of those that it's got the little compartments in it for, I think, 15 like ice cubes. And you put the water in, and then you lift up the lever and you crack the ice. And, they could have replaced it easily with something that was, from the dollar store and plastic. But apparently I've learned these ice cutters are like great ice cutters. But it was interesting to me. And you can see the age of it. But it was one of the things that they chose to keep. The other thing was that when we were deciding which furniture they were going to take, they had a living room. And I remember my grandparents had a living room. And the joke is that nobody ever lived in the living room. In fact, they're not even making houses with living rooms anymore. Those have become obsolete. Now we're building offices and playrooms and man caves. But this was the couch that had been in their living room. I even remember my grandparents at one point having the plastic over the furniture. And then when company would come, they would take the plastic off. But I remember the mover that this floral couch in the picture had been given to them as a wedding gift. They'd been married more than 60 years. And when the movers came to move it, they made a note of saying how heavy the couch was. It was much heavier than anything that they were used to moving. And I have to say that in my years of being in this business, I had not ever had a client that had had a couch that was that old that they had taken with them. It wasn't the one that they had selected. But what I noticed is, and if you look into this, is that because things had to be made better to last longer, because people didn't spend money and they were not a disposable society the way that we now are. And it's funny because I can go into a person's home, never meet them, and just based on what kind of furniture they have, can get a good sense, or what's on their kitchen table, can get a good sense of who they are and how they live and how old they are. And as you go to subsequent generations, which now is the new silent generation, people born after 2000, and millennials, they are way more into experiences. And so like one of the trends that you may or may not have heard of is something called van life, where people, millennials and the new silent generation, they are moving all of their possessions into vans and living out of their vans. Well, you know that you can't be in a 3,000 or 2,000 square foot house and fit everything into a van. So they're really looking at their life and they're minimizing. We also live differently. This is a picture of my grandmother's silver. This is one of the things that I did get when she passed away. And it's funny because my daughters all want this silverware because we use it for special occasions because it has to be hand washed. But we're not typically doing the Sunday dinners and we're not gathering the way that we used to gather. And when we do gather, we're using paper and there's so many pretty paper plates. And now we even have plasticware that looks like silverware. And so we're living differently that way. And in the bottom picture is a photo from IKEA. And it's funny that our movers, actually, a lot of them will have a policy that they will not be responsible for IKEA furniture because it breaks after one move. So the generational shift, go back to that photo that I showed you of the 60-year-old couch that was super sturdy, meant to last, versus now we go to IKEA and we replace the couch either when we move, which is way more frequently than subsequent generations did, or, on a whim. So we are living differently. So that's part of the reason that our loved ones don't want our belongings. So another funny story is I had a call. It was from Yelp. Someone had seen us, and it was the adult son. And he called because his parents were probably getting ready to make their like 6th or 8th move. I don't remember. It's one of those numbers, but it was not from the home that he had grown up in. And in the meantime, I'm talking to him, and he's got 2 young kids screaming in the background, and he's apologizing. And I said, don't worry about it. I've got kids of my own. It's no big deal. So when I got to meet his parents, he basically said, if somebody doesn't come in and help my parents, I don't think their marriage is going to survive. So I went to meet with them, and it was funny. They asked to take a selfie with me to prove to their son that they had met with me. And the father was a minimalist and the mother was a saver. And I always joke, in most relationships, there's a piler and there's a filer. It's very not common that both couples are going to save and get rid of the same way. So a filer and a piler. But in this case, the woman was holding on to things, and he was a minimalist. And so she was touring me through the house, and we got up to the 3rd bedroom, and I noticed that on the nightstand it wasn't even on the nightstand, actually. It was on the dresser. It was the nursery lamp that I would think had to be her son, because it was from the 1970s. It was those plastic balloons that, and I remember because one of my brothers had one like that. And what I thought was so funny was that this lamp was in her home, but yet she had grandchildren who the son could have taken this lamp if he had wanted it for his kids. So why was she holding on to it? Anyway, and like I said, it was not the functional lamp that was on the nightstand. It was on the dresser. So I always tell, I messed up. Well, I am going to just going back to perfect is the enemy of done. I think I lost somewhere in there by accident, there is a slide that says it's not an empty nest until your kids get their crap out of the garage. So I always ask people when I'm doing the talk, how many of you are storing things for your loved ones that now, and again, it's different to store things for a loved one if they're in college or in their first, place when they're, just kind of getting on their feet. But if they own a home and they have children and you're still holding on to their stuff, you might want to consider giving them a deadline and saying, come and pick it up. My stepfather passed away in February, and before he got sick and died, I was visiting Florida, which is where I moved from, living in California. And he said, okay, you got to go through your bedroom and get your stuff. And again, at this point, I am a senior move manager. And so I bought a duffel bag and I went through my old closet and I started thinking, okay, if I'm only bringing a duffel bag back, what am I going to bring back and what am I going to pitch? So among the things that I pitched, I had kept these Barbie, I didn't get the Barbie dream house. I wanted the Barbie dream house. I didn't get the Barbie dream house, but I had the Barbie cruise ships. I had 2 of them. And it was funny because I'm very sentimental, as I've mentioned from the onset. And I was hoping that I would have a daughter, which I was blessed with 3, but none of them wanted my Barbie stuff. And it really didn't fare very well either. So that was one of the things that couldn't be donated, and it got trashed. But I remember bringing back these masks because I had collected masks from Mardi Gras and just wherever I would travel. And all 3 of my daughters at one point were involved in theater. And I was like so excited to bring my masks back and let them put them up on their walls. And none of my daughters wanted my masks. So just, make sure that if you're storing something, that it's really something that your loved ones are going to want. Okay, the other thing I kind of wanted to talk about with the generational shift is that, the other reason that we have a hard time selling our belongings is that you have to have a market for something in order for people to buy it. It's just like the real estate market. And if you have held on to all of these belongings and now you have, these younger generations who don't attach to sentimental items the same way and aren't collectors, that's one of the reasons that there's not a market for it. But the other reason is that they are shifting their priorities and they would rather spend money on experiences so that they can post pictures on social media because they value the whole fear of missing out, look at my life, and again, experiences over things. Now I want to give you some hoarding humor, which hoarding isn't really anything that we should joke about. And I've learned a lot about hoarding as a result of being in this business, but also didn't know how much of it was really linked to a pre-existing mental health condition, which is usually anxiety or depression. And what I've discovered is that 5% of the population actually has hoarding disorder. We do not call them hoarders. And they actually think of things in a very different way. And I want to talk a little bit about that and also kind of distinguish for you some important things. One of the first things to note is that it usually starts in early adolescence. I actually, again, ADHD, always had the messy room. I was a pretty good kid. I didn't do drugs. I wasn't out getting in trouble. But I remember being grounded because my mother wanted my room clean and I didn't have the capacity to do it. And I would try and try, and then it would be messy again. And I have, of my 3 daughters, my older daughter has ADHD, and her room makes mine seem like it was like beautiful. And I've had to let it go. And we've talked about it because my mom also has a little bit of hoarding disorder. She's one of the examples of people that when my grandfather passed away, my mom had just closed on her first home, like the same weekend. And so she kind of went into a depression and she wasn't able to unpack. And then 9 months after my grandfather died, my grandmother died unexpectedly. So my mother had never fully unpacked her home. And then my grandmother died. And there were a lot of things that she didn't need, but she didn't want them to go to Goodwill. And so she took all of my grandmother's things. And so this really became the catalyst for my mom becoming kind of what I jokingly call a border hoarder. She wouldn't have been somebody that would have, at that point, wasn't a full-on someone's going to come into the house. It wasn't there weren't going to be dead animals, but she definitely had too much to live comfortably. And I jokingly, although not joking, it was a border hoarder. And usually as people age, the hoarding can become a bigger deal. And I've had this conversation with my daughter to just say, hey, it is something to be aware of. Part of it is also, again, that people with ADHD, spatially we aren't able to organize, like we get overwhelmed by it. But some other things that I learned about hoarding disorder that I think are important to know is that they actually have a phobia to letting things go. And I don't know if any of you listening have a phobia. I have a significant phobia to fish. I think something must have happened in a past life, but also a roller coaster. Like if you even mention a roller coaster to me, I can get that anxious feeling in the pit of my stomach. That is how it feels for someone with hoarding disorder to throw something out. It's a physical feeling that it doesn't feel good for them to do that. And another reason that people, besides that feeling, is that they get a high from the acquisition of things. And so if you think about, going out shopping, there is a little high that you get. So typically you're trying to sort of fill a void or bring yourself happiness. And the way that it's good to help with hoarders is if you can bring in another party, that's good. But to first of all, remember that this isn't just something easy for them. Like they will have a physical phobia to getting rid of things. So it's important to start with to the low hanging fruit. So things that would be easy for them to get rid of, and then they build up a tolerance to doing that. And as I mentioned, there typically is a comorbid condition. But the consequences of having too much in the home are safety issues. There's a 63% increase in falling risk, a 58% increase in fire risk, and hygiene problems, which also lead to medical problems. And again, the treatment for hoarding is exposure therapy and retraining your brain. So a little bit of humor. I talked briefly about what we as a society were doing with going into Costco and hoarding the toilet paper. But I have definitely noticed in seniors that a lot of people sort of do have their Costco closets. And again, I think that people are wanting to have something that grounds them. Okay, so this picture on the left is actually, I call it the craft hoarder. And the craft hoarder is a person who will, like if they break a necklace and there are a bunch of beads, they will put it aside. And usually a craft hoarder is pretty organized, but they have all of these crafts or these projects that they intend to do one day. And the joke about that nicely organized tons of bins of stacked craft projects, that's mine. Yep. So I understand the mentality of how this all comes into place. And the important thing is that you be in check with it, you identify it. And if you have family members, that also helps people, from becoming true hoarders. And again, it tends to really happen as people age and things become more difficult to take care of. Okay, so when you are going through the downsizing or the organizing process, it's really important to consider your lifestyle. And, how are you really living? Are you still doing crafts? Are you still baking? Are you traveling? And what is the life that you want your home to support for you? And how do you want people to gather in your home? And how do you want to feel in your home? So it's really important when you begin that process that you take all of that into mind. And again, another thing to consider when you're starting to go through the organizing and downsizing process is aspiration versus reality. The photo that I have here it's funny. And I'll share a personal story with you first, and then we'll go into it. So I typically, when I do the talk in front of an audience, I'll ask people how many have more than, 2 or 3 sizes of clothing in their closet. And most people will raise their hand. Well, I probably at one point had 4 or 5 different sizes. And back when I was married, my ex-husband said, why are you holding on to all of these clothes? And I said, well, I'm hoping to fit into it one day. And he said to me, if you can get back into those clothes, I will buy you new clothes. Well, the joke is on me because I got rid of the clothes. And then when we got divorced, I went through what I affectionately called the divorce diet, which anyone who's been through a divorce will probably attest to the fact that between the stress and the idea that you might have to go out and start dating, there's something that motivates you to lose weight. I think the stress is probably a bigger part of it. But so a lot of times we do hold on to things aspirationally. And the closet picture on the left was a woman in her mid-80s that we moved. She didn't have to downsize as much because she was going into a pretty big space, and she had gotten a closet company to come out. But the pictures, I would say 4 of the shelves, and so for those of you who are listening and can't see, I've never done this as a podcast. There are probably 40 pairs of high heels. Now, how many women in their mid-80s are wearing high heels? And maybe occasionally not 40 pairs. So that's a situation of aspiration versus reality. The picture on the top right is 5 coolers. Actually, 6 coolers. And this was a couple that we moved. They had been in a pretty big home with I think a 3-car garage. They didn't want us to help them do much downsizing. And this was a case where if we had done some sorting before, they wouldn't have had 6 coolers. Now, these are actually stacked in the patio outside of where they moved because they didn't have a garage and we didn't have a place for 6 coolers. Probably only needed 1. This is the same couple. They had kept a lot of salt and pepper shakers. And, so again, the sorting process is important when you're going through and gathering your belongings. So I am going to, okay. One more slide, and then I'm going to take a break, and then we're going to start talking about how we just talked about how we got here, and then we're going to talk about how we get out of it. So the next slide that I'm showing is it says, do you own your home, or does your home own you? And this is a picture. They did a study of the traffic in a home, and it sort of goes back to what I shared in the beginning of the talk and why I called it, do you own your stuff, or does your stuff own you? That we are living right now in the average home, which has tripled in size in the last 50 years. And, what is the reason that we have these big homes? And it goes back to we are supposed to, or our neighbors have it, but is it what we really need? And so again, when you look at the foot patterns of people, and, everybody needs a kitchen. Most people, will congregate in a family room, and of course a bedroom, but outside of that, we really don't need the space that we're living in. And I remember when I was selling real estate in Florida, I remember working with first-time home buyers, and they really wanted a house with a guest room. It really wasn't in their price range at the time. And so we talked about the idea that it might be less expensive for them to rent a hotel for loved ones than it would be for them to buy a house just to have a guest room. So it's just really important when you're talking about living in your home that you think about how you're really living in your home and what needs that home, needs to meet. So this is part 2. We're going to roll or stop. I'm going to pause and come back, and I'm going to give you some suggestions on, okay, we've gotten ourselves into a situation, and how do we get ourselves out?